World Press Freedom Day, South Africa has been rated as satisfactory in the World Press Freedom Index that's been released by Reporters Without Borders. The index looks at several factors, including the imprisonment and killing of journalists. So joining me now is Kate Skinner, who's from the South African National Editors Forum. Kate, thanks a lot for joining us on Union News today. Now, when we're looking at how we're faring, satisfactory.
Satisfactory is not bad.
Is satisfactory like 50% at school or 32%?
No.
Where are we sitting when it comes to satisfactory? What is the meaning of satisfactory?
So there are 5 categories. So there's good, there's satisfactory, and then there's 3 other kind of, problematic, difficult, serious. So we're not bad. We're in the same rankings as, for instance, the UK, Australia, Austria. In fact, we are ahead of the UK. So we're not bad. Obviously, we'd want to be in good. But
how do we get to good? Is it because of the relationship that we have with various stakeholders? I know that specifically around this time of election time, journalists are in a very iffy relationship with political parties. So it's like a love-hate relationship with political parties. Yeah. So what would take us from that satisfactory level to the good level?
So it's interesting. So there are a couple of things. As you were saying, it's around the legislation. It's around imprisonment of journalists. It's around deaths of journalists. Obviously, those would be putting you into the very serious and problematic categories. But it's around our legislation and also exactly what you're saying around the rhetoric. What are political leaders saying? Is there heat around journalists? Are journalists being intimidated? Are they being intimidated on social media? Are they being intimidated, out there in the field? Yeah. So if we had less heated rhetoric and intimidation in terms of social media, I think we would jump up a few points. But also it's interesting to note that we are number 3 in Africa. So we are behind Namibia and we're behind Ghana. And we see ourselves as South Africa as kind of like at the head. We're not. We're behind.
Is it because of the political maturity with which we seem to express our differences, or is it also around issues of different legislation and policies that get put in place, sometimes to the detriment of one being able to even do an investigative piece when it starts becoming classified and you start touching it, and then you start treading on real hot waters, really? Yeah,
completely. So legislation is also very important. And for instance, in 2004, we put in legislation which was kind of anti-terrorism legislation, and that meant that we dropped quite a few points. So you're absolutely right. The legislation is very important. I mean, rhetoric around the Media Appeals Tribunal obviously was very problematic, although we don't obviously have that in place. The secrecy bill, those kinds of pieces of legislation, although, of course, it's not on the statute books, thankfully, because of civil societies, absolute outcry around it. But just those kind of threats do push you down the rankings.
And then for a maturing democracy, I mean, 25 years in, would you say that our democracy is maturing enough where all stakeholders concerned? Because the media plays a significant role in the way in which the democratic process gets implemented in any form of state. 25 years in, would you say that we are maturing in the way in which perhaps journalists are even reporting, and perhaps the way in which civil society is responding to some of those investigative pieces? Because civil society may also be the biggest critics of journalistic pieces.
Absolutely. Are we maturing? I mean, I think it's interesting because we have dropped down. So it means that, my sense is that we take a couple of steps forward and then we also fall backwards. So the issue is you've got to be constantly vigilant. I mean, there's a lot of pieces of legislation going through Parliament. We must make sure that all of those are pro-freedom of expression. I think the thing which is very powerful for us as South Africans is our Constitution. And the fact that in fact, the Reporters Without Borders specifically talk about our Constitution as being something that pushes us up the rankings. So that is fantastic, and it has been in place, post-apartheid. So we have, as part of our Constitution, freedom of expression, access to information, freedom of the media, all enshrined. That's fantastic.
But also,
the legislation
must rest with the journalists as well, because journalists cannot, handle themselves without any form of reining, because there's responsibility and there's a code of ethics that must be adhered to, so that on both sides, on one side is ensuring that the journalists can do their job, and on the other side it must ensure that the journalist actually reports ethically and free and fair.
So there are definitely a lot of issues around the responsibilities of journalists.
Yeah.
And so when you have very heated rhetoric around journalists, it's not that journalists, can say, well, actually, it's not about us at all. There's no self-reflection needed on our side. There's absolutely self-reflection needed on our side. The other thing which I think is very important, and the Southern African Editors Forum is talking about this, is the economic situation of the media, the issue around retrenchments, the issue around far less journalists in the newsroom and journalists having to report on so many stories. That is problematic. That means that sometimes there are mistakes, and that means that there's less credibility. With less credibility, then there are more attacks on journalists.
We can have a conversation the whole day.
We can go on, keep going.
But we have to leave it there for this morning. Thanks a lot for joining us and shedding some light just in terms of the realities and where we are ranking when it comes to the press and press freedom in the country. Kate Skinner there, who's from the South African National Editors Forum, giving us the latest on that.